Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I'm joined by Elian Corona. Thanks very much for coming on, mate.
Thank you very much for having me. Good to be on the podcast.
Yeah, it's great to have you on, man. Really fascinating episode that we've got planned for today, and hopefully all of our listeners are going to enjoy it as well. It's been a while since we've been over stateside, as you can probably tell from Elian's accent. Just before we get into today's topic and go through everything, Elian, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born in California and I'm from Mexican heritage. Both my parents are from Mexico. My father's from Chihuahua and my mother's from Jalisco. And so I'm studying currently in South Carolina in the United States at Clemson University and working toward a career in football, ideally as an opposition scout or an agent. And I'm hoping to pursue a career in that and studying in Barcelona currently, working with UE Sant Andreu locally as a coach and studying on my own as well.
That's really interesting. So by opposition coach, is it, sort of analytics and data analysis and things like that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm focused heavily on data analysis, player recruitment, and talent identification.
That's so cool, man. I love things like that, and quite a lot of it goes over my head, the data analysis. It's something really, really interesting, and I like reading a lot about it, And from the research that you've done on today's episode, I'm sure you've got a fantastic career ahead of you because it's so in-depth, it's so knowledgeable, and you really, really go deep diving into stuff when you can. So, yeah, it sounds like a perfect role for you, man, and it's really, really interesting as well. The club that you're working with, how have things been there? Have you been doing reports on their opposition during their season? Is it more of a kind of general internship? I'm just really, really interested and fascinated in this kind of line of work.
Well, currently I actually operate with a couple different clubs. Throughout my time here in Barcelona through a university program, I've been working with UE Sant Andreu, who are a local team from Barcelona playing in the fourth tier. And I'm just doing some under-18s coaching. It's nothing in the analysis field. However, I've worked with my university team, which is Clemson University, as an opposition scout, kind of doing opposition reports for the ACC and national tournament run, which we were lucky enough for, we prepared well and we were able to win both tournaments, so I'm really happy to be part of that. And I also work with Monterey Bay Football Club, who play in the second tier of the United States.
Brilliant. Yeah, it's really, really cool, man. And as I said, it's such a fascinating area to work in as well. You meet so many people. You're working directly with football clubs, and I think for myself and a lot of our listeners, that's all anyone within this community can really ask for, So, but we'll get on with today's episode. It's quite a hot topic at the moment. Today we are going to be delving into the history of the US Open Cup and go over all of the current issues, controversies and problems that they've had recently that haven't really been of their own doing as well. It's going to be a really, really good episode, a really, really fascinating subject, and as I was saying to you off air, I think it's one that a lot of people from, I suppose, Europe and the UK might find quite interesting because the MLS and the setup of the MLS is often quite confusing, and I think things like the Open Cup, although I would probably enjoy the Open Cup more for different reasons, but a lot of people don't really understand how the MLS and soccer in America is set up. So have you had any experience of that while you've been studying in Spain? Actually, have people been asking you quite a lot about the MLS, the kind of clubs you support, or what the setup is, or anything? Because there's a lot of tiers and a lot of layers to it, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So especially at San Andreu, a lot of the players and especially my other coaches that I work with are fascinated by the fact that there's no promotion and relegation within the league system. And they just have a really hard time wrapping their head around the concept that there can be a professional league where there's no risk of relegation or really reason for these teams to make sure they get the best results that they can at the end of the season if they're not looking to win the title.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that really stuck out for me as well. No promotion and relegation, and that kind of takes away from a lot of stuff as well. But that's a conversation for another time. But the US Open Cup is obviously a very historic tournament within the United States and within soccer of the United States. Much in the same way when we recorded the episode with Brock Milden on the soccer history of Utah, we kind of said you can look at soccer in Utah through the Danes Cup, which was really their kind of first tournament, and everything revolved around that. And in a lot of ways, it's the same for the US Open Cup. You can really get a good idea of a sense of the history of soccer in America through the US Open Cup and the types of different, I guess, leagues and franchises that it's existed through. It really has a lifetime of its own as this kind of historic piece, and of course, as we'll come to touch on later, it's fallen quite in hard times, but we'll start things off from the very beginning and go through the general history. And as I said, you've done quite a lot of work into this, so let's start from the very beginning. Tell us about the US Open Cup, how it was founded, how it came about.
So it came around just about the time when all the other leagues around the world were being founded, which a lot of people might find surprising that soccer's had a large presence in the United States pretty much in the same timeline as England or Spain or France. And it began, the first edition of the Open Cup was 1914, and it was for professional and amateur teams, because at the time there was actually a very big professional league on the east coast of the United States with teams funded by companies and investors signing players from abroad, and the US Open Cup was a way to bring together those professional teams with the amateur teams from the region, giving them all a trophy to compete for. It was modeled after the FA Cup, just like so many other tournaments around the world, and it was first known as the National Challenge Cup. And the trophy was originally donated by Sir Thomas Dewar, who was one of the early patrons of United States soccer. He was really into bringing up the league system, investing heavily in the professional teams, and really building a structure for a competitive professional league.
Yeah, Thomas Dewar is a really interesting guy, and what's kind of interesting about him as well is that there's a kind of thread that underlies a lot of our episodes where we talk about people from Scotland really spreading football to a lot of places around the world that people wouldn't normally think. So we have US, Canada, Argentina, Brazil, Hungary, loads and loads of places, England, as well, importantly. So this is just another Scottish guy who's went over and taken football to another part of the world, and it's really, really fascinating how he's done it in a period where football is still taking off in other parts of the world as well. Like, I find it really fascinating, and I think Brock mentioned it as well, that a lot of people don't realise that soccer in America, because there was still migration going on and all these other things, there was loads of works teams as well. People don't realise that soccer in America has such a longer lifespan and such a longer existence than it actually has. And I think speaking with the New York Cosmos Collective on Twitter, I think it was, put us onto a number of teams from Brooklyn and Manhattan and New York, and every single one of them was a diaspora team, and I love the thought of that. I love how, you would have New York Irish, New York Mexico, New York so and so, etc., etc. It's really, really fascinating to me, and I think especially on the East Coast there, that's where you can probably see where these professional leagues would spring up, because there's going to be lots of people, there's going to be loads of people from working class backgrounds, loads of people who've been through different migrations, different levels of generational trauma. And this is where a lot of these football clubs come from, and a lot of the clubs that we support as well. And I find it really, really fascinating, and it's a really, really interesting point about soccer in America that, as I said, a lot of people don't really know about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the history of the sport, especially on the East Coast, is really interesting with all the immigration. I think that definitely helped to grow the game on the East Coast. I mean, you have all these working class families who maybe were introduced to the sport back home. They come over to a new country where everything's unfamiliar. And the one thing that can bring them all together, regardless of where they might be from in Europe, whether it be Ireland or Scotland or England, is the sport that's growing and that they all are interested in pursuing as a career maybe, or as something to do on the side for fun. And I think it could really bring all these different groups of people together.
Exactly, and I think that's the important point. It was a way for people to come together. It was a collective act. It was something that, for 90 minutes, you'd be doing this common thing with people that were from the same community as you. So it's really, really fascinating, and it happened in other areas across the world as well. So before it sort of took off, I suppose, was there any kind of unofficial playing of the Challenge Cup, as it was called then? Did it officially kick off in 1914, or were there kind of elements of it being played beforehand, is what I'm trying to say, unofficially maybe?
As far as I could find, it seems like officially the first time it was played in 1914, but there was plenty of other regional tournaments or regional cups for areas that were played beforehand, and that kind of played into the idea of forming it. Obviously, it was heavily inspired by the FA Cup in England as a almost nationwide tournament, which in that time, the nationwide leagues was pretty limited to New England. But just kind of a nationwide tournament that brought together all these smaller tournaments and kind of made one big prize for every team in the country at the time to compete for.
Okay, I get you. Interesting. And yeah, I suppose in the United States, a national league or a national cup at that point would have been something that would have probably even been unthinkable, just with the logistics and the cost of travel and things like that. It would have been a logistical nightmare to try and solve in that period of time. So, obviously the cup kicks off. Who were the first winners? Tell us about the first team who really challenged for the cup, and the first sort of dominating team as well, because there's a lot of parallels that you can draw with the FA Cup and the Scottish Cup and other similar trophies too.
So the first couple years were definitely dominated by teams from New England, specifically Fall River and the Pennsylvania area, in an area called Bethlehem. And the first team to win the cup was from New York. They were Brooklyn Field Club. It was just a local athletic association where a bunch of people just came together, were able to create a team, and were either lucky enough or just good enough to win the first cup. As I'm assuming, or based on what I could find on the first edition, it was really not contested by that many teams. However, by the time the second year came around, Bethlehem Steel had formed an absolute mega team with players from Europe and heavily backed by the Bethlehem Steel Company, based out of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And they dominated the cup in the early years, winning 4 out of the first 6 trophies, which is similar to the FA Cup, where you have one team dominating a lot of the early history. So teams from Fall River began to contest for the title as well around the 1920s, which coincided with the further establishment of a professional league in New England. Fall River FC won 4 titles in the 1920s. They were founded by Sam Mark, and he was a wealthy businessman from the area who was interested in growing the sport in the region. And he actually invested very heavily, created a 15,000-seater soccer-specific stadium right across the border in Rhode Island. And that was due to Massachusetts having laws regulating the play of sports on Sundays. So he decided to build the stadium across the state line in order to enable the stadium to host matches on Sundays.
Got you. That is really interesting, and the name Bethlehem Steel obviously rings a lot of bells. I think it would probably ring a bells for quite a lot of people, just because, it is and it has historically been one of the largest steel manufacturers in the US, so of course they're going to have a works team. It was the same as the potteries in Stoke or the shipyards in Glasgow, wherever else you want to go. There's always going to be these teams that spring up around big industrial areas, and Bethlehem Steel were one of them, and it's no surprise that they became one of the early domineering teams for the East Coast as well. And I suppose when you look at the historical context of America in that time, you're talking 1914, so I mean, there's parts of America that still haven't fully been explored or really settled in properly yet. I'm right in saying that. I mean, it's more or less just about there, but not fully. So I think, that probably makes sense that there's going to be that sort of East Coast domination in the beginning. So yeah, it's really interesting. I like looking into these kind of historical contexts and how they might play into the landscape of football in a country at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the high concentration of immigrants in those areas, especially in New York and Boston and other East Coast cities, I think that really contributed to the massive growth and, at the time, professionalism of the sport in that region, just because there was such a concentration of people interested in the sport. In other areas, the immigration wasn't in high of numbers, and in the South, the immigration definitely was not concentrated from Europe, so there wasn't as much interest in growing the sport in those regions.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. That seems like a fair point. So Fall River were one of the earlier teams that dominated the cup, if you like. They had 4 titles, I believe, and they were one of the larger teams. So tell us a little bit about them, because I like hearing about these teams that, in that day and age, they're probably nothing more than amateur teams. Maybe some players are getting paid a little bit extra on top of stuff like that. So I'm really fascinated to hear about these clubs that maybe not a lot of people would know about. So tell us a little bit about Fall River.
Yeah, absolutely. So although Bethlehem Steel did have 5 titles during that era, the real defining team of the era was Fall River. They have 4 titles currently, and they could technically get another one because there is a resurgence team. However, there's the 4 titles from that area that really brings attention to Fall River. They represented one of the most successful teams and one of the most successful eras of early American soccer. They wore green and gold kits, and there's some really cool historical photos you can find of this team together wearing these kits that look pretty good for the time. I mean, I could definitely see some modern remakes doing pretty well. They played in the American Soccer League, which was the first stable, fully professional league in the country, concentrated of teams from the New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts regions. They're actually the most successful team in the American Soccer League's history, and they won 11 titles in their 9 years of existence, including 7 American Soccer League titles, the four Open Cups we mentioned, and they won a Lewis Cup, which is a regional tournament from the Massachusetts and Rhode Island region.
Brilliant. Yeah, really dominating team, really strong side by the sounds of it. Quite a lot, within that as well. They managed 3 titles in a row from the ASL, so 3 in a row. They got a double in 1924, then they went 3 in a row again in 1928 to 30. So yeah, they were a really big side. And they had quite a lot of international players as well. And what stuck out to me was that there was a few players from Motherwell, which stuck out to me for a couple of reasons. So Fall River, do we know, are they a works team? Were they founded around any steel manufacturing?
Actually, no, it was a pretty personal enterprise for the founder, Sam Mark. He was just very interested in bringing the sport to the region, and he really invested heavily. Like I mentioned previously, the 15,000-seater stadium, recruiting players from over abroad. There's various mentions of him doing overseas scouting trips in the summer, which at that time would have been by boat. And to just go over the summer and watch all these players play in Scotland and England and try to recruit them to bring them back. So he was actually investing heavily, and a lot of these players were professional, being paid a living wage just to play for Sam's team.
Yeah, no, I was just curious, just because Bethlehem Steel was mentioned at the time, and Motherwell Steelworks in an industrial area within Lanarkshire. So it's quite interesting how a lot of their players went over to play in America as well. They had quite a lot of famous players as well. Ireland had players from Egypt, so very much an internationalist and multicultural side, which for the time is really interesting in itself as well.
Yeah, I think it really speaks to Sam Mark's knowledge of the game and passion for the game, that he was willing to find all these players abroad and make the effort to convince them to move overseas and play for his team. This team actually gained such notoriety across the globe and for their dominance of the early American game that they earned the nickname of the American Menace across the world, and you can find a lot of references to that nickname on the current Resurgence team's website and in old newspapers of this phenomenon that was starting to become known in South America and in Europe of the American Menace, this team that's signing all these players from abroad and winning all these American Soccer League titles and just really showing a true passion for the game that was brought by Sam Mark.
Yeah, and they were quite fond of a tour as well. They played Rangers a couple of times, I noticed. They toured in Europe. They toured South America. They had a tour of America as well. So they were obviously a very big side if they're able to entertain teams from across the globe, and they had this nickname that was tied to them. So obviously a very successful and very dominating team, and very powerful team at the time as well, by the sounds of things.
Definitely. I think their recruitment really speaks volumes. They have a lot of the players who played on the first United States World Cup squad that actually finished third in the 1930 World Cup. And among those would be Billy Gonçalves and Bertrand Patinaud, who are pretty famous. I mean, Patinaud scored the first World Cup hat trick in history. And he was actually born in Fall River. So a local player playing for a local club scoring the first ever World Cup hat trick really speaks volumes to the recruitment and the passion for the game that sets Fall River apart for me, although they might not be the most successful as, for example, Bethlehem Steel. They just have a quality of players that is represented in the World Cup squads and in the international friendlies they were able to play. The one that really speaks out to me is the 1927 exhibition match against Uruguay, which was held right after the squad had a lot of success winning the gold medal at the 1924 Olympics and right before the 1928 Olympics, where they would win gold again, and obviously right before they hosted the first World Cup. So they were really able to bring probably the best team in the world at the time to Fall River to play a game which ended in a 1-1 draw, a very respectable result against, as I mentioned, probably the best team in the world at the time.
Yeah, it's respectable to be able to host one of the greatest teams in the world, and the host of the first World Cup and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, it's amazing, and I like the kind of philosophy behind them and what you mentioned there about there's this kind of local team with local guys in it. Some of the guys have come from further afield, sure, but it's this great mix of players and talent coming together, and yeah, unfortunately their constant touring that ended up being their downfall, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, definitely. They were trying to definitely build off their past success. They had just played an Italian 11 made up of mostly Brescia players, played Kilmarnock, Rangers, and various friendlies in the United States. And the owner, Sam Mark, decided it was time for a European tour of their own. About time to go visit these teams at their home stadiums instead of just inviting them over. So he planned a big world tour in 1930, and they all left for August, but there was two notable missing players, which was Gonçalves and Patenaude, and they were actually competing at the first World Cup in Uruguay at the time. So the owner obviously didn't really consider this a big deal, but a lot of these European clubs that they had planned friendlies against really were hoping on having these two players in the squad. And seeing those two names off the team sheet really turned a lot of them off the friendly. And so a lot of their big European matches ended up being canceled, which really put the team in a tough financial state, as they had to pay for their own accommodations, their own hotel rooms, showing up to these unfamiliar cities and unfamiliar places with nowhere to stay, no match to play, because a lot of these teams would cancel on the day before, the day of the match. And it really, really put the team in a tough financial position. So after coming back from the tour, the owner, Sam Mark, decided to move the team to New York to try to really jumpstart the team or earn some finances. But unfortunately, this coincided with the beginning and the real worsening of the Great Depression in the United States. So that, combined with the moving of the team, an unsuccessful merger that actually saw the team's name changed, it really, really took the team into a bad direction. And even though he tried to move the team back to Fall River in 1931, there just wasn't enough money and not enough interest from the fans to keep supporting a professional club.
That's a shame. It's like a lot of factors have just combined into one there for something that's really, really unfortunate, and it's good that there's a Resurgence Club. We'll come and speak about them a little bit later on. But yeah, I guess it's one of those things for the time where clubs could just pull out of games like that, and if you embark on a big tour like that and you're not getting any gate receipts from it, you're going to end up hemorrhaging money basically. But it's still a shame, and obviously they tried the merger. We've discussed mergers a lot in here, but I mean, you would still assume that there was a big identity attached to this club from the local people, and if they're being moved to New York and they're being merged, then they're going to alienate their core supporters and the people who first came out to support them. So it's one of those things, and with the Depression, it was maybe just an inevitability that the club would end up folding, which is a shame. But they weren't the only successful club within this sort of early, I guess, pre-World War II period of the US Open Cup, or the National Cup as it was known then. We've mentioned Bethlehem Steel, but there was a few other clubs as well, wasn't there, that kind of started really setting the cup on fire when they played in it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually another team from Fall River that preceded the Fall River FC of Sam Mark. That was the Fall River Rovers. They actually were playing 3 consecutive finals against Bethlehem Steel. They won the last 2 and actually lost the first one against Bethlehem Steel, but they definitely paved the way for the Fall River FC by showing that that area had strong talent and had a strong interest in the game. A lot of these Open Cup finals drew very respectable attendances. You're talking numbers like 10,000, 12,000 to watch an Open Cup game when automobiles were not even very common. So a lot of people were, who knows how they were getting to these finals, but they were coming, and they were interested in watching this sport grow and watching these finals against this team from a company that was well known at the time.
It's really interesting, and I think it's quite interesting to draw comparisons, especially because there's a lot, as you say, there's a lot of travelling involved. Automobiles aren't really a thing, or they are, but they're not affordable for working people. It's really still the start of soccer getting its foothold within the United States. But then you go back to 1874, the very first Scottish Cup final between Queen's Park and Clydesdale, which were, Clydesdale, the football club, kind of sprung from a cricket club, and Queen's Park, obviously based in Queen's Park in Glasgow. It's both, pretty urbanised areas, it's in a city. The attendance to that was only 2,500, and even though it's the first Scottish Cup final, football at that point, even just some friendly matches were gaining high attendances. It was really grabbing people's attention, and to only get 2,500 people along to that in Glasgow, which is a city, whereas you've got 10,000 people travelling to this, it's brilliant. It's absolutely amazing, and I think it really speaks volumes for the amount of misunderstanding that a lot of people actually have about soccer in the US. And I know there's this whole thing about it's MLS and they just bought a soccer league and all this kind of stuff. But if you actually dig deeper, there's such a deep heritage of soccer in America, and just the different teams that sprung up, the different competitions there's been. And I think it's led to this really nice sort of grassroots level in the US out with the MLS, which everyone else is kind of exposed to, if you want to say that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just speaking on the attendance, once again, the 1917 Open Cup final between the Fall River Rovers and Bethlehem Steel. The first leg was played in Fall River at a stadium before Mark Stadium was even built. And that final drew 13,000 people to Fall River, a very small town at the time, to watch an Open Cup final with the return leg being played in New Jersey and drawing 7,000. So the attendance figures are really impressive looking back on it. And even the 1925 final between Bethlehem Steel and Ben Miller's drew 18,000 people to a stadium in New York, which I can't even imagine how 18,000 people are getting to a stadium in 1925.
No, exactly. And again, I think it's really understated the travelling aspect of this, because obviously in the United States, what is an 8-hour drive for you guys is like a day out for us, you know? So that there's this whole, and it's like, you guys are travelling that distance to go and watch a foot. Yeah, no, it's brilliant. I completely agree with you. It's really, really fascinating, and it's a brilliant element that's kind of seldom spoken about and seldom explored within kind of studies of soccer in the US. And you're right, to get those attendances with the context that we've discussed is absolutely amazing. So one thing that I wanted to ask was, you know, during this period from 1914 really up until sort of the World War II era, you know, like Bethlehem Steel, Fall River, were there large periods of time where the same clubs would dominate the cup, or was there, you know, kind of a succession or a revolving door of different clubs that won it for a period of time? Because even though it was this national competition, it seems like that because there was different league systems in place for different states, it seems like it was a little bit complicated, with some clubs falling out of it, some coming back in, and, you know, for periods it was a little bit messy, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it speaks volumes that a lot of the clubs that won the Open Cup and were very dominant in these early days didn't last very long. I mean, Fall River only lasted 9 years, and Bethlehem Steel lasted even less. And it speaks volumes that these teams that were so successful folded so quickly. I think a lot of that has to do with the Great Depression. A lot of these early teams really struggled to find financial backing, especially with the financial state of the economy at the time. It hit really hard in that New York and Boston region. And in addition, you see a lot of these amateur teams winning the cup after the Great Depression and during the Great Depression, because they were the only ones able to compete in it. All these professional teams that were so successful before the Great Depression didn't exist during and after. So you see kind of a shift in the mid 1920s, or I guess it would be later 1920s to mid 1930s, where all these works teams, which obviously were not professional, just made up of laborers from these companies, going on to win 2 cups in a row, going to play in a couple finals in a row. Among those, you have Styx and Bayer and Fuller, based in a brewing company out of Chicago. You have St. Louis Central Breweries, another brewing company from St. Louis. All these teams that you really wouldn't think would be winning these cups during a period where the FA Cup was seeing more and more development into a more formal tournament, playing so well in these cups. But I think a lot of that was down to all these professional clubs in this pretty stable league system being really hard done by the Great Depression and not being able to find longevity.
Yeah, key word there being longevity, I think, really, really important. You know, for all the discussions that we've had on this podcast about clubs coming and going, and it's because of mergers, because of name changes, badge changes, things that, you know, things that are messing with a club's identity and heritage and the things that people attach them to. I think that one thing we haven't really spoken an awful lot about is longevity. And it's something that can be influenced by those things that I've mentioned. Sometimes it isn't. But I think if it doesn't look like it's going to have that longevity, it's very, very difficult to keep it afloat. But I think things like having an identity and having roots in your community are things that ultimately affect that. But yeah, I think that's a really, really key word. And it led to this sort of, you know, clubs coming in and out constantly. And again, it's all about perceptions, and people would often, you know, view it as being quite messy, and I think that's maybe why it makes research on it quite difficult for people that aren't based in the US or don't know an awful lot about the system. So it's very, very interesting to hear it from you know, your perspective and all the research that you've done about it, and I suppose kind of untie this knot that a lot of people see as being the US Open Cup and the history of soccer in the US. But of course, after World War II, you sort of move into the NASL era.
You really definitely see a shift, as I mentioned, after the Great Depression, with professional teams disappearing almost as a whole. And I would put a lot of that down to the Great Depression, but also the competition that the sport saw at the time. Obviously, as it is now, there's other professional sports that were growing in the country, namely baseball and American football. And this competition really drew away a lot of the money from soccer to these other sports. So between 1938 to around 1955, 1960, you see amateur teams winning the cup and teams from small leagues, small cities where it's almost impossible to even find the leagues that these teams played in because they were just made up of maybe a group of friends. But people who had passion for the sport kept the cup alive and brought it to the 1970s and 1960s. And I wanted to go into the most successful team from that era, which was actually Maccabi Los Angeles. And they have 5 titles, tied with Bethlehem Steel for the most of all time.
And I did see their name, and I thought to myself, because of the name Maccabee, are they potentially Israeli migrants or the Jewish migrants who've come to America? Just because there's that Maccabee, sort of, I can't remember the word for it, but it's in front of the name of the club that you get Maccabi Haifa and things like that in Israel. Would I be right in saying that?
Yeah, absolutely. So they were founded by a group of Israeli expatriates as a Sunday league team, and they only began playing competitively in 1971 in the Greater Los Angeles Soccer League, which was similar to those early New York leagues, a league comprised of teams from immigrants from different countries. So you had a team from Hungary, a team from Croatia, a team from Mexico, a team from El Salvador, and all these teams just playing at a semi-professional, semi-competitive level. But as that era was not incredibly strong in terms of professional teams, this team with Israeli expatriates actually was able to dominate. And this is a lot, in big part, thanks to a lot of these Israeli immigrants being former professionals or former players themselves. And they brought over experience, they brought over knowledge, and just experience of being able to play in Europe at a very, very competitive level. And just playing in this essentially Sunday league team and playing in a competitive tournament, which was the US Open Cup, which led to their dominance.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's great, and I think this is one of the interesting things about it for me is that it's not just big teams, if you want to put that in air quotes, that are playing in it. You've got amateur teams, you've got Sunday league teams, you've got teams who have come from a grassroots level, teams who have just come from a couple of friends having a kickabout. It's really, really open and it's really inclusive to try and have every single team within America in it, and I think that's what's brilliant about it. Don't get me wrong, the thought of trying to organise that is giving me a headache, but it's just fascinating how teams across every single level were included in it, and some of them even went on to win it. I mean, was the tournament itself professional? Was it considered amateur? Did it ever kind of slip down to amateur?
Yeah, absolutely. So, especially after the fall of the early soccer leagues in the 1930s, it really slipped to an almost amateur tournament. And a big, big part of the tournament's history is the NASL, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with the New York Cosmos, the LA Aztecs, actually did not compete in the tournament. They almost saw it below them, and they just refused to play in the tournament as a whole. Kind of, they were afraid that it would take away attention from their league, that these finals would draw higher attendances than their own games, and so they really showed a avoidance of the tournament. And that, in part, obviously led to it continuing as an amateur tournament, even though there was a new professional league that was being played in the United States. So during that era, it was really almost completely amateur, but you still have this team showing incredible dominance being Maccabi. And I personally am really curious about what a result would look like between Maccabi and, for example, the LA Aztecs. But the NASL refused to organize friendlies against Maccabi, and I think it might have been because they were a little bit scared that this team that's been winning 5 cups in a row, showing complete and utter dominance with players from all different parts of the world. I mean, Maccabi had players from Mexico, Argentina, Germany, Romania, and obviously all these Israeli expatriates that used to play at a professional level. So I think that they might have been a little bit scared about this team that is essentially an amateur team, showing that they have quality and they can compete against a professional NASL team.
Yeah, they didn't want this little group of guys coming in and just ruining their franchise before it had even taken root, sort of thing. Yeah, it's really interesting. So they wouldn't allow them to arrange friendlies at all.
No, not at all. They Maccabi definitely tried. The founder, or one of the players, I should say, who was Eli Marmur, he spoke about this recently and said that yeah, the team was looking to play against this professional team or looking to kind of try to show their level. Obviously, they were dominating the cup. They wanted to see what they could do. They wanted to see how good these professional teams were and what they can do playing against a team who is of a professional quality. And at the time, you had players like Cruyff and Beckenbauer playing in the league, so they wanted to compete against these players. But all these NASL teams just did not want to organize friendlies.
Wow. It's shocking, but I guess you can't be surprised when you look at the history of it. And again, the franchise thing comes into it more often than it probably should. But no, a really dominating team. And again, interesting how multicultural they are, and you've got this diaspora element to them, and other things. So there's obviously a very rich heritage here. And I think it's really in this NASL era, from what I've read, that the history of the US Open Cup as being an inclusive and amateur and grassroots tournament really starts to take root and take hold, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree. Definitely. I think that honestly, the NASL not participating really contributed to that because these teams are proud of competing in this nationwide tournament, having a chance to win a title that was in the past won by professional teams like Fall River, and it really made these amateur clubs and amateur leagues proud of participating in this trophy and really started to build a legacy of the trophy as one that anyone can win.
Yeah, exactly. I think you're right in saying that the NASL deciding not to take part in it probably helped maintain and really preserve what the trophy has going for it. It's like if these big teams are just going to come in and bulldoze everyone, then it really loses its charm, it loses its touch. And then the teams further down will stop competing on it and they'll make their own trophy, but then of course they're just going to fall further and further out of the spotlight, really. And if that was the case, then maybe we wouldn't be having this discussion today. It's just one of those sort of sliding door moments. But I agree with you that I think the NASL teams choosing not to take part probably done more good than it did harm for the US Open Cup at that time. But of course, NASL, very, very nostalgic period for a lot of people that we speak with on Twitter as well. As you mentioned, the Aztecs, the Cosmos, the San Jose Earthquakes, who I know are kind of back now. You had the Caribous of Colorado, who have one of my favourite strips that I've ever seen in my life. It's great. Just think about running around in that in the rain. It'd be absolutely hellish. But yeah, you have all these great teams, and I know they were franchised, and I know there was that element of it, but I think it was a shame that a lot of them didn't compete in the cup because they looked down their noses at it. Their loss, that is what it is, but I think it's a shame that those teams chose not to take part and just kind of add something to it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Maccabi especially had players that were of NASL level, as proven by various players that went on to play for NASL clubs or came from the NSL to play with Maccabi. Among those would be Tony Douglas, who was capped for Trinidad and Tobago, Guy Newman, who was actually the son of a former Gillingham and Portsmouth player. There was players of these levels of NASL quality playing with teams in the US Open Cup at an amateur level. So I really would have been interested to see how this Maccabi team that was so dominant would have compared against the professional teams of the time.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, you had Maccabi around this time as well, just similar to the early period of it. Was there any other teams that really sprung out or anyone that really stood out during this period of time in the US Open Cup? Big heroes, big teams, dominating players or things like that? Or was it a lot more kind of casual and as we've mentioned, amateur, so players would change hands quite a lot?
During that time, it's really Maccabi Los Angeles that stands out as the main team that would continue to make finals and be dominant out, because most of the teams they played in the finals were teams made up of immigrants, teams of people all from the same background. I mean, in the 1973 final, for example, there was Cleveland Inter, who played against Maccabi Los Angeles, made up of Italians from Cleveland who made an Inter kind of fan club, and they were just competing in the tournament and were good enough to reach the final. Or you also have Chicago Croatian, a team made up of Croatian immigrants living in Chicago who were good enough to make the final and unfortunately just couldn't beat Brooklyn Dodgers at the time. But yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah, there's loads of parallels that you can think of to the A-League in the early days of the A-League. And it's just all similar. It's just all these diaspora communities forming football clubs for each other, and then they take off and more people start joining, and it's this brilliant thing. It's a really, really great phenomenon, I think. To see different people join in with diaspora teams and really just enriching each other and enriching the leagues that they play in. So it's fantastic. But obviously, moving into the modern era, we then enter this kind of period of MLS and the sort of hyper capitalism franchise stuff that comes with that. We'll discuss this period because obviously it started in the 90s, which maybe isn't so much modern anymore. But obviously the MLS comes along Does it affect the US Open Cup at all? What things changed because of the MLS? Because it was a huge thing at the time, and it remains to be this massive thing that dominates and impacts soccer in America.
Yeah, so the MLS really shook up the whole structure of United States soccer at the time. You had other professional or trying to be professional leagues, such as the USISL league, trying to really kind of get a foothold or do something. But then you have the MLS coming in with huge financial backing, really big investment, and kind of just blowing all these other leagues out of the water and taking over the soccer scene at the time. It was really detrimental to a lot of teams who were trying to take root or trying to win something, and to just have this massive professional league kind of come out of nowhere with massive money, massive signings, just really dropping the ball on all these little teams that were maybe trying to get to a level where they could compete. So you have the renaming of the 1999 US Open Cup to be named after Lamar Hunt, who was part of the original NASL and had a big part in the MLS's founding as well. But I really wanted to talk about the unique team from this era because ever since the MLS became a thing, every single US Open Cup has been won by an MLS team except for one. And that one team is the one team I wanted to focus on, being the Rochester Rhinos, who had an absolutely incredible run in the 1990s and were able to reach two finals and win one of them.
Absolutely crazy. In this era where, it's buying trophies and buying leagues and throwing money around, and this team from Rochester just come out of nowhere and win it. It's fascinating. Tell us about it. I want to hear the story because it sounds great.
Yeah, absolutely. So they were founded in 1996, which actually was the first year the MLS was played. But they were playing in the final iteration of the American Professional Soccer League, which was another smaller league, one of those leagues I mentioned as being kind of crushed by MLS. And they were able to find good success in that American Professional Soccer League and bounce to another sort of semi-professional league, which was that USISL Select League. And they were just kind of bouncing around these lower leagues. But the 1999 edition, they entered in the second round along with all the other teams in the A-League, which is their league that they were in at the time. And they were able to get past a semi-professional team from New York, which, interestingly enough, those editions after extra time, after full time, actually went to a golden goal or a sudden death. There were no penalties, just golden goal, which I think is pretty unique for the time.
Yeah, you don't get enough of a golden goal anymore these days, do you?
Yeah, definitely not. And I think it's pretty cool because they won a few of their matches in this sudden death or golden goal phase. But after they beat that semi-professional team, they took on the Chicago Fire, who had actually won the 1997 Cup and would win the 2000 Cup as well. So they were a powerhouse team at the time, a team that was made up of fully professional players with massive backing, and they were drawn against them in the next round. So they had to travel to Rochester Stadium in New York. 10,000 people showed up to watch this match, and they actually took the lead in the 51st minute with a nice cross headed in by Yari Alnut, probably the most famous player in their history. And it was a really, really brutal game with 47 fouls, 7 yellows, and 2 red cards after a brutal fight. A Chicago player, frustrated by losing the match, decided to take down a Rhinos player, and a whole brawl broke out, and it was just ended up being a really brutal match. But it worked in the Rhinos' favor, and their grit and determination, really desire to show that they were up to the level of this professional team, sent them to the quarterfinals.
Yeah, grit and determination. Those are the words that I thought of. That's being generous. Oh God, 47 fouls. That's absolutely insane. And bro, it's like a classic cup match. You've got this a small team that are beating the big guys. They're getting frustrated. Obviously, there's blows being thrown. It's the magic of the cup. I love it. I love everything about it, and I think it's a magical part of the story, and it's part of this. It's sort of put it into myth, and it led them to go on winning the cup. It's really, really fascinating, and I mean that's something that's going to be spoken about for a very, very long time. The fact that they managed to win it. Are they still around, the Rochester Rhinos? Did they survive?
They're unfortunately not around anymore. There was the last year they actually were playing was 2022. They had actually a very famous investor, Jamie Vardy, look to try to become part of the club, but it was just really difficult to get started. They played in the MLS Next Pro, which is almost like a development league for MLS sides, but just poor financial management and a really difficult financial environment for the backers kind of made the team fold, but yeah, they unfortunately aren't existing anymore, which is sad for the community because they really had built a pretty solid local fan base thanks to their early success in the Cup and thanks to a lot of success in their local leagues, which is really unfortunate for a lot of the supporters.
Yeah, I completely agree. That is a shame, and it's never nice to see a team that's won a cup like that in such a fashion like that end up going under and folding and not existing anymore. So you never know. Maybe they'll come back eventually, but I know there's a few more loopholes that you need to jump through to be able to do that in the US than there is over here. But obviously, different MLS clubs then ended up winning it. So I guess obviously where any SL clubs didn't decide to enter it, was it a case where MLS clubs could choose, or were they permitted to enter it?
I believe that the U.S. Soccer Federation requires every team affiliated with the federation to play in the Cup, at least in some fashion, and that just being any kind of team at an amateur or professional level to at least have some kind of relationship with the Cup, whether it be qualifying by winning your local league or some form of qualification process for every team affiliated with the federation, which means that any team in a semi-professional capacity, or at least at an amateur level and affiliated with the league.
Right, got you. Okay, so any club that's kind of affiliated with any league throughout any level, as long as you're part of this sort of pyramid or sort of system, then you're required to play in it.
Yeah, or at least have some kind of way to qualify or participate in the Cup in some manner, and that's to kind of keep the history of the Cup alive and to ensure it continues to be a tournament for everybody. So you can have a local team, such as one that sticks out to me that always sounds super interesting is Bavarian United. They have a team in the USL League too, but they obviously are required to play in the Cup even though they're just an amateur team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. And it is actually interesting some of the things that you say there. We'll come on to touch on those soon. I mean, who has been the most successful team in the US Open Cup since the MLS era came around? And I find it's weird because I find it, because we're in the MLS era now, it's just, for me personally, I find it less interesting. I don't know if that makes sense or not, just because it's stopped becoming this thing where, you know, teams further down the pecking order, if you like, compete in it, and all these sort of big money back teams have come into it now. So, you know, it's quite interesting how your mindset sort of switches around that.
For me, I still see the magic, at least until this past year, I still saw the magic of the Cup being alive in various iterations. I mean, you see MLS teams really dominating the Cup since 1996, with Rochester being the only early exception, reaching the 1996 final, losing to DC United, and then going on to win the 1999 final against Colorado Rapids. They were the only team in the really early days of the 90s competing to maybe challenge for the Cup, but recently it's really just been MLS teams dominating, the sole exception being Sacramento Republic, which in the 2022 edition reached the final and were unfortunate to lose to Orlando City. But for me personally, the magic of the Cup was definitely still alive. My team I work for in California, Monterey Bay Football Club, they actually knocked out the San Jose Earthquakes in our second season as a club in their history, went on to lose to LAFC on penalties in the next match. And that's honestly, I still say, our greatest moment as a club so far has been playing in that game against LAFC and only losing on penalties in a super close match. And it was just, I just always remember the energy of that night. And we sold out the stadium for the first time in the club's history, and really just seeing the impact that this cup had and this chance of beating another MLS team after already knocking out San Jose. It was magical, and I will always remember that night as just being so special for the club and for the community.
Incredible. Yeah, it's amazing, and it must be amazing being a part of that as well, it should be said, like seeing these shock results, these cup sets take place. So yeah, there's definitely still a magic to it, and you still get little runs like this. You know, as you mentioned, Sacramento and your own club Monterey Bay as well. And I think there's always going to be, well, hopefully there's always going to be results like that. And I think that kind of leads us nicely on to the next part of the podcast. And as you'd mentioned just there, you know, they wanted to keep it open and inclusive to keep the spirit and the history of the cup alive. But as we've seen over the last few months or so, that might be quite contradictory, and I think this is quite a messy and quite a complicated situation as well. And where I took notice of it was when people on our Twitter feed, they started saying that 3 days before the contest was due to start, there'd still been no information sent to clubs about fixtures and things like that. So, you'll know more about this than I will, Elian. So tell us a little bit more about what's been happening here, because it sounds like it's a bit of a complicated situation.
Yeah, it's definitely very complicated. I mean, as you mentioned, the Cup's always struggled, especially in recent years, with organization and really ensuring that teams have a pitch to play on or enough advance warning to organize a pitch and to organize a fixture and to get the message out to fans. And especially this year, we saw a lot of pushback from the MLS, and it resulted in the MLS announcing that their professional teams would no longer be competing in the competition, and they would instead be sending their development sides to compete, which would be the MLS Next Pro teams. And that, for me, was really almost hurtful because as a team, as a player, or as an employee of Monterey Bay Football Club, who just the past year had had such a great experience in the Cup, it really felt like they were taking away the one chance we had to play against a team of a professional caliber with investments that rival Europe, where we are professional, but we don't get to compete at that super, super high level. And there's no opportunity to do so through promotion and relegation. So having the Cup was really the one thing we could hold on to as a way to challenge, a way to show our quality, and a way to upset these big teams. So their announcement they were going to be pulling out was hurtful to a lot of U.S. soccer fans, kind of saying, you're taking away this one competition that's the most historic competition in the country, gives teams from every level a chance to compete, and kind of is the one chance that these teams have to play against or play at a higher level since there's no promotion and relegation. And so a compromise was ended up being reached on March 1st of 2024, so very recently, that 8 MLS teams would play in the Cup and 11 reserve sides would play in the Cup. So kind of 50-50. But it's pretty difficult because there's not really a clear process as to how these 8 teams were picked. From what I can gather, it's kind of the teams that aren't playing in the CONCACAF Champions League. They were stating fixture congestion as a big reason why they were pulling out. But personally, I find that very difficult to believe because I'm sure you might have seen some of this on Twitter as well, but these MLS teams that are not playing in the Cup this year have been scheduling friendlies on the Cup dates against, for example, Celtic. I know they're playing, I believe it's DC United, and I'm not sure what kind of fixture congestion they're talking about if they're able to schedule a friendly during that date. And the League's Cup has also been stated as getting in the way of the Open Cup, but that's a very new tournament that's not qualification based. Every team in the league competes for it. And it's kind of just a cash grab, in my opinion, just having MLS teams play against teams from Liga MX, and for not really anything that's historical or worthwhile. And I think that losing the Open Cup to play in a glorified preseason tournament is really difficult for a lot of fans, especially of these smaller clubs.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. It's ridiculous, and it's shocking but not surprising, to be fair, that this is the way that they went about it. And I suppose the big worry is that if MLS pull out, then the US Open Cup loses a huge amount of its financial backing through that, and it'll be a struggle to keep afloat. I mean, obviously you're then maybe talking about going back to the days where the top flight in soccer in America don't compete in it, but at the same time you're still taking a part of it away from it. These gate receipts and these journeys to face big teams that these small teams will do it must be huge for them. It must be huge for their survival, for them to be able to sign players and do things off the field with the money that comes from it. So it's going to have a massive impact if the MLS fully pulls out the US Open. But again, as you said, it's like everything's a little bit of a cash grab because you've got them organising pre-season tournaments with Celtic and other clubs going over. They've now got the League's Cup and they're organising other friendly games, and it just seems a bit of a shambles that, I think it looks like that these MLS teams aren't taking the US Open Cup seriously to the point where it's now being very detrimental, and the US Open Cup is now in serious jeopardy of not existing for much longer. But as you said, there's kind of been a compromise reached on March the 1st. Do you see that compromise holding? I mean, say this time next year, where do you think we'll be as regards the US Open Cup? Because it sounds like the MLS have really just kind of slapped together a solution because they didn't realise they were going to get so much fury and kind of uproar about this.
Yeah, well, the compromise was actually reached with the United States Soccer Federation because the MLS is its own entity. It's owned by the league owns every team in the league and technically just rents out rights to the owners and rents out rights to the teams. That's why every team in the league is sponsored by Adidas for their kits, because the league has a partnership with the brand, and so that's why every club has the same sort of kit sponsor. So it really speaks to the power that MLS has, that they could just pull out as one entity, because it's not up to the owners, it's not up to the clubs, it's the league can decide for everybody, which is a really unique situation. But I'm concerned personally that it's going to get worse, because they were only able to come to this compromise because U.S. Soccer made threats against the league saying, oh, you're not allowed to compete in the CONCACAF Champions League if you pull out of the cup. You're going to lose funding from the Soccer Federation of the United States if you pull out. So the league kind of compromised just to keep some of their rights afloat. But they definitely don't want to, in my opinion. And I think that it's in real danger of having all MLS teams pull out altogether, because the league has shown a strong desire to pull every team out. And they only stopped because the Federation threatened to take away their qualification places for the Champions Cup.
I mean, I don't know if I'm looking into it too much, but it sounds like the soccer in the US is heading towards a bit of a split. I mean, I don't know if that's maybe a bit too extreme thinking about it at the moment, but that's what it certainly sounds like. And maybe the writing's been on the wall in regards to that for a while, because the MLS is, as you said, is very powerful. Huge amount of wealth tied up in the MLS and major league sports in general. They're organising other tournaments. They've pulled out of these traditional cups, so I don't know. I don't know what the general feeling is about that, but to me it seems like it's heading towards something that's a lot bigger and you know, a lot more detrimental and a lot deadlier for smaller clubs in the US.
Yeah, I think a big criticism of especially soccer and other professional sports in the United States is the non-competitive aspect of it. Since there's no promotion or relegation, it's a closed system where to join it you have to pay a massive franchise fee. San Diego FC, the most recent team that will be joining, paid $500 million to buy a franchise spot in the league. So there's no opportunity for growth or really a small team to make it, because you have to have a huge sum of money to even compete. And a lot of the league is based around making money. For example, the NFL, the NBA, primarily their main focus is to make money. They're set up around making money and not really competitiveness. And I think the MLS is kind of trying to follow the suit of those leagues and really focusing on growing as a company or as an enterprise, as a money-making venture, as opposed to growing in a competitive aspect.
Yeah, that sounds about right. It's they see it as a franchise and as you said, as an enterprise. They want to grow the brand. They want to grow the commercial aspects of it. You know, which isn't something that I agree with whatsoever. But you know, I know it's. I know that's what Major League does, and that's what they've always done. But when you mentioned the franchise rights there, I read a book by an author called Stuart McGill and Vince Raison, and it was called The Roaring Red Front, and it really goes around different football clubs around the world that maybe have quite progressive or left-wing fan bases, and Detroit City was one of the clubs that they wrote about. Great fan base, looked up videos of them, they're absolutely fantastic. And they said, you know, it's some people in the club want them to go up to the MLS, but then quite a lot of them don't, because you know you have to buy this franchise spot, and then you lose part of the club. You lose part of what you're singing about. You can't really sing about being this progressive and inclusive club if you're then having to pay $500 million to be part of this league. It's really opposed, and I think it does put quite a lot of teams within the USL Championship, particularly in other leagues, in a really tough spot, because as a football club and as a football fan, you want to see your team competing at the top level, no matter what that is. But if it's a closed shop and you're having to pay a ridiculous amount of money to get there, just for your team's rights and names and stadium to be sold and then maybe even moved away from its traditional home, what's the point? You know, is it going to be worth that? You know, it's a really difficult position to be in, I'd say.
Yeah, I agree. I'm really happy with the ideas, at least, that have been proposed by the USL Championship and the USL as a whole. For those of you who don't know, it's also a professional league system in the United States, a national level. You have the USL League One, which is a national league, also professional. You have the USL Championship, which is the top division, also professional. And then you have the USL League Two, which is made up of regional groups of amateur development sides. And This system has been proposing to implement promotion and relegation between the league systems and to really move towards a more European or competitive model for the game in the United States. And I think that'd be very valuable as a whole. It would provide an alternative to MLS. I mean, you have all these amazing clubs with pretty cool histories in the USL system. For example, like you mentioned, Detroit, they're competing in the USL Championship and they have an amazing fan base. I think of Tampa Bay Rowdies, who have an incredible fan base, and Louisville City, who have a pretty big stadium and really great history as well. And Sacramento also have a very, very large stadium, a really loyal fan base, and a really, really successful history in the league. And new teams are always joining. For example, the team I work for, Monterey, is 3 years old. This year we had Rhode Island join the league, also as a professional club in Rhode Island. And you have clubs really trying to join this league and having an opportunity to play in an alternative to the MLS where it's not so closed off and not so financially restricted.
I think it would be amazing if the USL were able to bring that in. I mean, I didn't realise that there was no promotion or relegation in the USL either. I thought there was a system of that, but of course, it maybe makes sense just with the geography and location of a lot of clubs. But I think it would be fantastic. I think it would be as impactful for soccer in America as the founding of the MLS was in the longer term. I think it would lead to more clubs wanting to join, and you would hope that eventually more people would follow the USL and go with this kind of European model as opposed to the MLS where it's a closed shop. What are you really competing for? You never know. Maybe there's an argument to be made that eventually clubs from the USL will be able to be in the CONCACAF and the Champions Cup and things like that. You never know. I think it's a really, really positive development. I think it's something that could have a lot of potential and offer a lot of opportunities for clubs in the USL and just football out with the MLS in general.
Yeah, I think it'd be a very healthy option for the USL to differentiate itself from the MLS in that manner by having promotion and relegation. And I think the Federation is in support of that. I mean, they've shown to be opposed to the MLS's franchise model in various stances, and especially recently, they've been opposed to the MLS and their pathway. So I think kind of having an alternative and this organization really showing a passion for competition and for the sport at a grassroots level with the opportunity to promote and relegate teams, there could be a lot of growth there with the USL Championship maybe getting a couple qualification spots for the CONCACAF Champions League, or if the MLS pulls out of the Cup, maybe giving the winner of the Cup a qualification spot. That would allow a professional team at a USL level or an amateur team who is able to win the Cup to compete in the Champions League.
Exactly, and you can see where it's going with a lot of the European teams and Celtic especially. Celtic are the team that I support, and last year there was a tour of Korea, the year before that there was a tour of Japan, and they've done tours of America before, way back. I mean, in the 50s, they played like Chicago Eagles and things like that, and there's always been a bit of a relationship there, obviously with the Irish connection and the Scottish diaspora as well. But now, when you see your club going over to the United States, if you see them going over to the A-League, God forbid they went over to Saudi Arabia, you know exactly why it is they're doing it, and it's because there's money tied up in it, and because you're attaching yourself to these brands, and it's transparent. You know exactly why they're doing it. But I think a lot of people would like to see their clubs going on tours of America and playing these teams from the USL instead of MLS teams, because there's just more in it. There's more passion. There's actual fans, and I know my friend who lives in Ohio, he's a Crew fan, but he said that he prefers going to the USL games because it's just such a better atmosphere. And I don't know what USL teams are around Columbus or in Ohio anyway, but he says he just prefers the atmosphere because it's just a lot better. And as we've discussed, there's just a lot more to it. There's a lot more history, it feels, and just a lot more things that people can enjoy when they're out and about there as well.
Yeah, agreed. I think the USL teams as a whole do a better job of being connected to the community. I think they really focus on community outreach and providing opportunities for local players. It's obviously a more competitive model than the MLS, so there's more opportunities for local players to make it. I know for my own team, for Monterey, we've recently signed multiple players from the local university. I would like to mention a couple. I mean, Walmer Martinez, Miguel Guerrero, Pierce Galloway, all locals who are from the area, who played at a local university, never got a chance to play at MLS level, but have been signed for this professional team in the area. And I think it's really important to give local talent a chance. And I think the USL does an excellent job of providing a pathway or an opportunity for these local players to get experience at a professional level.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think that's a really nice note to kind of wrap things up on. It's been a really, really fascinating episode. It's been an episode in two parts, of course, the history of the US Open Cup, which hopefully put a bit of a spotlight on it for many of our European and UK and Irish-based listeners. As I said, sometimes it can be a case of untying the knot with soccer in the MLS for us, so hopefully that's put a bit of a spotlight on what is a really fascinating and really historic tournament, and something that has a lot of history, and it's just a really, really deep and really good tournament to follow and pay attention to. But we've also talked about the current issues that it's had and the things that are going on behind the scenes that might, unfortunately lead to it not existing in the not so distant future. Hopefully that isn't the case, and hopefully there are moves made to protect this tournament. Hopefully the proposals that the USL are putting through come to fruition, because I think that would be a good thing ultimately. The more that it moves away from the MLS, I think anyway, can only be a good thing for different reasons. But is there anything else that you'd want to say or talk about, Elian, just before we finish up today?
I just recommend people to check out the USL and really give it a chance. It's available for free on YouTube in many countries in Europe, and the highlights are always available as well. I think it's a great league with a lot of local teams, and especially if promotion and relegation are implemented, I think it's really interesting. Personally, I love watching it a lot more than the MLS, so it's a great thing, and anybody's interested in the sport in the country, I would really recommend checking out the USL.
Yeah, perfect advice. I completely agree with that as well. Of course, to all of our listeners, thank you very much for tuning in for this episode once again. If there's a topic that you want us to cover that revolves around football history or heritage, then please do get in touch. You can reach us on X, that's @_footyheritage, or you can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. Please don't forget to check out our website as well, footballheritage.co.uk, where all of our written content goes. Some fantastic articles going up there from our wonderful contributors, so please go and check that out and give them support if you can. Of course, we cover anything related to football heritage, whether that's identity, place, old grounds, lost clubs, culture, community, you name it. If there's something that you want to talk with us about, then please get in touch. We're more than happy to have a chat with you in any case. But for now, Elian, say goodbye.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
And it's goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.